Welkom. Radio Paranormaal richt zich als alternatieve nieuwszender onder meer op paragnosie en bewustzijn, UFO en IT, samenzweringen, vrije energie, alternatieve geneeswijzen, metafysica en mystiek. In deze webcast heb ik het gesprek tussen Whitley Strieber en Uri Geller ingelast. De formule van Whitley Strieber is dat hij wekelijks een interview houdt met een auteur naar aanleiding van een vroegere publicatie of recent uitgebracht boek. Het is mijn bedoeling om eenzelfde werkwijze te volgen en dan zoveel mogelijk gesprekken te hebben met Nederlandstalige auteurs en publicisten die zich bezighouden met onderwerpen die binnen het interessegebied van dit internetradiokanaal vallen. De meeste mensen zullen Uri Geller als een spoonbender, oftewel de man die op mysterieuze wijze lepeltjes en andere voorwerpen uit zichzelf laat buigen kennen. Hij heeft zich destijds ook bewust op die manier geprofileerd, louter en alleen vanwege de inkomsten. Maar Uri Geller is veel meer dan dat. Luister hiervoor om te beginnen naar Whitley Strieber.
Today we're talking to one of the most extraordinary men I've ever heard of or known. In fact, one of the most remarkable people in history. Uri Geller. The book is The Secret Life of Uri Geller by Jonathan Margulis. You can get it on Uri's website. Uri Geller is almost beyond description. I have thought about how to begin this interview. All I can say is that he has probably had the single most interesting life I've ever heard of. So welcome to the program, Uri.
Whitley, thank you so much for giving me such a huge compliment. I don't think I deserve all that, but first of all, it's an honor for me to be on your show together today, and you may ask me whatever you want to, and let's start the interview.
I first heard of you from Andrea Puharich back after I had published Communion. He called me up and attempted to get the two of us together. And I thought I might start by asking you about his role in your life and who he was in your estimation.
Okay. I have to go back to the late 60s when I met the head of Israeli intelligence, who introduced me to the head of Mossad, who introduced me to Arik Sharon and Moshe Dayan. I hope you know all these names.
Of course.
Who then introduced me to the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir. Now, what happened during my time with Mossad, we won't talk about at this stage, but there was, in the United States, at the American government, the people who watch the Russians,
yes,
the intelligence services who were aware that somewhere in Russia they were studying people who were basically called psychics. And the Americans were very concerned that Russia was ahead of them in psychical research. And at that time in America there was no psychical research. There were no people with powers or remote viewers and so on. Somehow, Andrea Puharich had links to the CIA. Andrea also knew Captain Edgar Mitchell, who we all know, the sixth man to walk on the moon.
Yes, I know Ed Mitchell quite well.
Yes, and they knew Dr. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. Both Hal and Russell had obviously very strong links to intelligence services and to the CIA.
Both friends of both of us.
Yes. Of course. Now, with all these connections, they somehow managed to convince the Israeli intelligence services to let me out of Israel to be studied at Stanford Research Institute to validate. First, they wanted to validate my abilities and to see with their own eyes that what I do is real and it's not tricks. Because already then, I was hugely controversial in Israel. you can imagine,
yes,
by local Israeli skeptics, scientists, magicians,
you were doing the impossible.
Exactly. And I'll never forget the days when I performed in front of 5,000 people in auditorium. Skeptics came with huge telescopes and binoculars to catch me with, laser beams in my buckle belt and chemicals in my fingers and so on. So the Israelis let me go, but before I left Israel in 1972, they actually sent Andrea Puharich to test me in Israel. Before they accepted me in Palo Alto at SRI, they wanted to be sure that Andrea himself will be convinced. Now, in 1969-70, I was on a huge wave of success. But my success in Israel started ebbing away because I was not a magician, so I couldn't change my act. I did the spoon bending, the key bending, the mind reading, the moving of the compass, the seed sprouting, and so on. And people who came to watch my shows in big theaters, started shouting at me, "Hey, Uri, we've seen all that. Do something new." And I couldn't. So I started losing my big performances in big theaters, and I started performing in nightclubs. It was demeaning. It was humiliating. But that's what I did. I had to earn money. My mother was very poor. We were very poor. I wanted to stop my mother from working, so I was already then on a kind of a fame and fortune journey. And one day, performing in a nightclub, I'll never forget the place, it was called Zorba, I saw Andrea Puharich sitting around a table with another person, and I knew that he was an Israeli, and at the end of my act, he kind of summoned me to him. He lifted his hand and said, "Come over." So I came over to his table, and he introduced himself as Dr. Andrea Puharich, and he said to me, "Look, Uri, what I've seen you do is amazing, but any magician can do it." Now, I especially came from America. By the request of Edgar Mitchell and some other people who work for other sources. He didn't reveal that he had ties with the CIA then. And he said to me, "Will I allow myself to be tested under his controlled conditions in Israel, in Tel Aviv?" And I was very, very excited because, as I told you, I was finished basically in Israel, and my dream was coming true to come to America. So Puharich rented a little flat in the suburb of Tel Aviv in Herzliya, and he tested me under controlled conditions. He filmed everything, and he was mind blown. I freaked him out, because then other things started happening, which we'll get into in a moment. But that was the first time I met Andrea. Then he flew back to America. He arranged my trip. I was scared to go to the States first, so I landed in Germany. I spent some months in Germany, and then I came to California. I landed in San Francisco, where Hal Puthoff and Russell Tagg were waiting for me at the airport.
Very interesting, because, when I had a number of instances in which I could have gone in the direction you went in, even though what I do is quite different and not nearly as dramatic. And I made a choice not to. I made a choice to stay away from the intelligence community, largely because my father had been involved, and he was very adamant that I shouldn't be involved. But rather than go in that direction just now, what I would like to do is to go back to your earlier years. And when did you first notice these things about yourself?
Okay, I will tell you in a moment. I have to mention, though, because you used the word dramatic, the most dramatic events happened to me and Andrea during these testing, and we'll talk about that later because that was a mind-blowing part.
Yeah, do talk about that later.
For me and for him, of course, and it's so fantastic that I want to prepare your listeners to kind of that what I'm about to tell you later on in the interview is just will freak you out if you're a believer. But I was about 5 years old or 6 when I was playing in an Arabic garden across our apartment building in Tel Aviv. This was in Betzalel Yaffe Street, number 13. There was a huge enchanted Arabic garden. There is a big bank on it now. And I heard kittens cry. And, as a 6-year-old, I was looking for the kittens. And suddenly, out of nowhere, in front of me, there was a huge sphere of light. And I looked at it, and suddenly, out of nowhere, from the sphere, it was almost like a laser beam. A bolt of light, whatever it was, hit my forehead. It was so powerful that it actually pushed me into the ground. I fell into the grass. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I ran home to tell my mother, she, of course, didn't believe me. She said I dreamt it, or I'm making it up, or I'm just, this doesn't happen. But I know it happened, and very soon after that, I was eating soup in our tiny kitchen in the same apartment building, and that was the first time when the spoon started bending in my hand and it broke in two. But I have to now jump 40 years later.
Yes.
In one of my trips to Israel, there was a BBC documentary, not The Secret Life of Uri Geller. There was another documentary playing in Israel. And when I came back to England, I got an email from a retired Air Force officer who said to me in the email, "Look, Uri, I saw a documentary about you last night. It was made by the BBC, in which you talk about a sphere of light. Well, let me tell you something. I was there, and I saw that sphere of light." So I jumped on the email, I asked for his telephone, I called him up, and he told me that he was a young Air Force soldier walking back to his parents' apartment on Rothschild Boulevard, which was just on the corner of Betzalel Yaffe Street, where the garden was, and he saw a little boy with a white shirt, black hair, curly black hair, which I had, and this huge sphere. And then he described how I ran back to the apartment, and the sphere followed me very quickly, and it kind of exploded on the facade of our apartment building, and it darkened it. Now, for me, after 50 years, this was an amazing validation. Because whenever Whitley, whenever I talked about this and wrote about it in my books, because I never backed away from this story, I had no proof. But here was a man, a credible retired Air Force officer, who told me that he saw it, and he saw me, and he saw the sphere. So that's when it all began. I was about 6 years old. Yes, first of all, I would very much like people, our listeners, to understand that my website is not a money-making website. I have enough money. Money doesn't motivate me anymore. So when Whitley said that you can find my book on my website, the book is free for you to read. You can even download the book. So
I should have added that. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Most of my books on my website are free. And what is important is that there are many other things that you can use as a tool for your mind on my website. I also allow the latest BBC documentary, The Secret Life of Uri Geller, to be seen. And I think if that documentary by an Oscar-winning director doesn't impress you, if you're a skeptic, and if that film doesn't change your mind, then nothing will.
Yes,
then
true.
there is another documentary called Uri Geller, A Life Stranger Than Fiction. So if you view those, you will more or less get a kind of a drift of my life. Now, throughout my career of show business and entertainment, I realized that the spoon bending, it is so freaky and it is so strange and weird that I can turn it into a placebo effect and help others with it. And
what I would like to do, if you don't mind, is to return to your life and to talk a little bit about what happened at SRI with Russell and Hal. I know them both and have talked to them about you, and so listeners, just to confirm something before we go on, I've heard from them personally the same stories Uri is going to tell you. And so there's no question about that. They stand behind these stories too.
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, again, please, all of you, just watch The Secret Life of Uri Geller on my website, and it will reveal to you exactly what happened at SRI. But what happened is the following. I was put under laboratory-controlled conditions, and there was a series of experiments that was conducted on me by a group of scientists to see whether I can read minds, whether I can remote view. Russell and Hal have come to SRI in the morning with secret drawings in sealed envelopes, which I wasn't allowed to touch, and I had to tell them what's in the envelope. I had to read the minds of computers. As a matter of fact, I remember once a computer drew a kite, and I drew a kite. It was exactly the same shape with a tail and the ribbons. And, you know, a kite is not a house or a car or the sun. It's just very, very unusual drawing. So then I had to try to levitate a little weight. I think it was 1 gram weight from an electronic scale. I had to predict the face of a dice, where they shook a dice, you know, in a metal box. So these are the types of experiments I had to do under laboratory control conditions. And of course, the CIA was watching all over this, and they passed all the information to the CIA. And the paper that they presented to Nature magazine was actually published in Nature magazine, which happens to be the most credible scientific magazine in the world.
In the world, yes, absolutely.
And of course, this caused huge controversy. You know, the magicians and so on. I mean, we'll talk about that if you wish too. And
yes, so sure.
But that was only one set of experiments. Then I was taken to the Lawrence Livermore Radiation Lab. That's where they build nuclear weapons. And incredible things happened there to scientists. And then I was taken to the American Naval Surface Weapons Center in Maryland, and then to some other laboratories, and then overseas in England, in France, in Germany, in Japan. I can go on and on and on. Every scientist, when Nature came out, wanted to test me. And I basically became a guinea pig, which I hated. I wanted show business. I wanted to be on Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas.
Of course. You
know, I wanted the glory, the fame. I was on an ego trip. I wanted fame and fortune. I wanted to make a lot of money. I was really very much into Uri Geller. I was ruthless. And then came the biggest lesson in my life when Johnny Carson invited me. And everybody told me, well, if you get on Johnny Carson, you made it in America. But what I didn't know is that I walked into a trap, because Johnny Carson was an amateur magician, and he linked up with Randi. James Randi is he was a kind of a chief debunker at that time.
I know him well, or I know a lot about him. I know
in
more
my
about him
opinion,
than I would like to know.
He was maybe still obsessed by me, but he was and is my greatest free publicist, and I have to send him actually a bouquet of flowers, because all publicity is good publicity. But when I was on Johnny Carson and the spoon didn't bend enough and so on, I sat there for 22 minutes humiliated, and I thought, that's it, I'm destroyed, finished. Go back to your hotel, pack up, and fly back to Israel. So after the show, I was so drained, so disappointed, so depressed, that I was so drained that I fell on the bed, planning to wake up in the morning, pack up, and then fly back to Tel Aviv. Now, what woke me up was a phone call. The operator calls me up from downstairs, and she says to me, Mr. Geller, I have a Merv Griffin on the line for you. So I said, what? You mean the Merv Griffin? And she said, that's what he says. He says that's who he is. And it was. And Merv Griffin says to me, Uri Geller, I saw you last night on Johnny Carson. I want you on my show this week. And that's when it dawned on me, Whitley, that there is no such thing as bad publicity. As long as they spell your name correctly. And Oscar Wilde, 100 years ago, said, there is only one thing in life worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about.
Yeah.
So out of that SRI, Nature magazine, a huge controversy started, but it basically fueled the wheel of publicity around Uri Geller, and it made me mystical, it made me mysterious, and that's the way I want to be.
Na het interview van Whitley Strieber met Uri Geller te hebben beluisterd, blijf ik met een paar grote vraagtekens zitten. Maar vooral ook door het bekijken van de BBC-documentaire The Secret Life of Uri Geller via Geller's website. Geller schrijft zijn paragnostische vermogens, waaronder psychokinetische, toe aan een bijzondere paranormale ervaring die hij op 5- of 6-jarige leeftijd had. Een energetische straal uit een mysterieuze lichtbol zou zijn gaven hebben opgewekt. Hij werd zich daarvan bewust terwijl hij diezelfde dag soep zat te eten, want opeens begon zijn lepel te buigen om vervolgens doormidden te breken. So far so good. Dit moet aan alle valse beschuldigingen ontzenuwen dat zijn spoenbending niets anders is dan een goocheltruc. En eerlijk gezegd, ik geloof hem. Geller en ik zijn in hetzelfde jaar geboren, dus ik heb de opkomst van het fenomeen persoonlijk kunnen volgen. Jaren geleden heb ik dan ook een paar staaltjes gezien van zijn mediamieke gaven die mij ervan hebben overtuigd dat ze echt zijn. Geller besluit al op jonge leeftijd met zijn spoenbending geld te maken en begint hiermee op te treden in nachtclubs. Zeer snel verwerft hij hierdoor nationale bekendheid in Israël. Tijdens zijn militaire dienst neemt hij deel aan de Zesdaagse Oorlog, die tussen 5 en 10 juni 1967 werd uitgevochten tussen Israël en zijn Arabische buurlanden Egypte, Jordanië en Syrië. Hierover zegt hij dat die oorlog zijn liefde voor Israël nog dieper in zijn ziel heeft gegrift. Kortom, hier spreekt iemand met uitgesproken zionistische gevoelens. Ik ken ze persoonlijk, de zionistische veteranen uit de Zesdaagse Oorlog. En geloof me, zionisme is niet uit te bannen bij die mensen. Zionisme is vergelijkbaar met fundamentalisme, misschien nog sterker, het is obsessief. Dat verklaart in zekere zin ook waarom er nooit een einde zal komen aan het Israëlisch-Palestijnse conflict. De geboren Israëlische Zionisten die ik heb meegemaakt, haten de Arabieren. Dit vertel ik om duidelijk te maken dat de positie van Geller als Mossad-agent niet zomaar uit de lucht is komen vallen. En zeker niet te danken is aan het buigen van lepeltjes. Afgezien van het feit dat Geller zelf de sterke ambitie, naar eigen zeggen, de sterke ambitie had om voor de Mossad te werken, was de Mossad, evenals de CIA, in die tijd op zoek naar mensen met paranormale psychische vermogens voor oorlogsdoeleinden. De Mossad en de CIA hadden in dat kader wetenschappelijke researchprojecten opgestart. Bij de CIA was dat aanvankelijk het project Stargate in samenwerking met het Stanford Research Institute, SRI afgekort. SRI was en is een zeer gedegen wetenschappelijk instituut met een uitmuntende mondiale reputatie. Een van de topfiguren van dat CIA-SRI-project was de arts en parapsychologisch onderzoeker Andrea Puharic. In het kader van de Mossad en CIA-projecten was Puharic kennelijk ook een soort headhunter, op zoek naar paragnostisch talent. Het is duidelijk dat Puharic naar een optreden van Geller in Tel Aviv ging met de bedoeling hem over te halen deel te nemen aan de geheime militaire projecten. Allemaal heel merkwaardig, ook omdat blijkt dat de Mossad en de CIA nauw samenwerkten onder project Stargate. Het lijkt me in ieder geval zeer onwaarschijnlijk dat Geller ooit is gestopt met zijn verborgen activiteiten voor de Mossad. Gezien de evidente samenwerking tussen de CIA en de Mossad, kunnen de spionageactiviteiten van Geller onder meer betrekking hebben gehad op het doorgeven van informatie over allerhande sleutelfiguren, al dan niet via buitenzintuigelijke waarneming. Geller is een zeer begaafd medium, die zijn dekmantel van showman met volledige inzet goed overeind heeft weten te houden. Er is nog een onverklaarbaar aspect. Geller heeft altijd een klein metaalachtig eitje bij zich, die hij in verschillende video's ook laat zien. Hij vertelt dat hij dat voorwerp van John Lennon heeft gekregen. Lennon zelf heeft hem verteld dat het voorwerp hem werd overhandigd door 4 ET's die 's nachts voor de deur van zijn hotelkamer stonden. "Keep it, John." "Keep it," John told me. "It's too weird for me. If it's my ticket to another planet, I don't want to go there." John Lennon heeft in verschillende interviews verklaard dat hij UFO's heeft zien cirkelen boven het appartement van Geller in New York City. Ook Andrea Puharic heeft gezegd getuige te zijn geweest van ontmoetingen tussen Geller en buitenaardsen. Het Uri Geller gegeven blijft dus vooralsnog onverklaarbaar.